Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach, and I am honored today for our coronavirus conversation to have one of the leading lights of the, say, reality movement around COVID, freedom, your rights, responsibilities, and how things are kind of panning out across the world with lockdowns and our kind of dissatisfaction with some of the dictates from government and so forth. This is Jeffrey Tucker. He is the president of the Brownstone Institute, and I have been very much edified and educated by hanging around their page. I've been honored to have some members and writers from their group on our talk before, but never, as of yet, the leader. Mr. Tucker is I guess kind of a true intellectual. You know, he pursues ideas, and he's fearless. And without further ado, I'm going to, ask maybe if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I founded Brownstone Institute in 21 because I knew that the COVID lockdowns would, opened up a new chapter in the history of humanity. I knew for sure we were facing a massive economic crisis. It wasn't there yet, but I knew it was coming. I knew that would turn into a massive political crisis. It wasn't there yet, but I knew it was coming. And it would ultimately end up in a huge philosophical debate and crisis over what kind of society we wanted and what kind of people we wanted to be, and what is the relationship between individuals in the community and the government and infectious disease, and all the questions that have been most important for human society for hundreds of years are all opened up freshly and new again, and I wanted to play a part in that debate.
How did you have a sense early on? What was your handwriting on the wall?
Well, because the tactics were so radical, so extreme, and so deeply, I would say, like ignorant and radical. The idea that we actually imagined you could shut off an economy and then turn it back on again is one of the most preposterous misunderstandings of the nature of human society I can ever imagine. And the fact that we believe that, just reveals that we faced a massive intellectual crisis. And then, and just the extent to which people had completely ignored certain truths of virology that we had struggled for hundreds of years to learn, and then just threw them all out the window just so immediately. It's very alarming because it suggests that humanity needed to relearn a lot of things. So I had previously to that been a bit of an optimistic technophile, kind of a Victorian style Whig, imagining a future of peace and prosperity. What I had not understood, and this is one of the reasons I founded Brownstone, was just how deep the decay had become, and how rotted the foundation of civilization had become. It's to the point that it could just all disappear in the course of what really amounts to just a few days. And given that, I figured we were going to face some sort of enormous reset along the lines of World War I, or something just equally momentous.
It's definitely shown some of the fault lines. I mean, I try to be an optimist. I'm not sure I've self-categorized my political ideology as clearly as you have, but I see. I try to look at the positive. Always look at the bright side of life, as Life of Brian, Monty Python, as he's about to be executed, of course. But one of the pluses perhaps is, and I'm not sure it's going to be ultimately one, is COVID-19. The reaction has been, in a sense, a canary in the coal mine, and it showed, I think, real weaknesses in the parliamentary system. I mean, our allies, our post-World War II allies, Australia, New Zealand, had a parliamentary democracy, and we kind of think they have the same rights we do. But Parliament is, in a sense, can be the tyranny of the majority. The places that essentially do the best and have served as kind of the crucibles for positive thought, which again it gets covered on brownstone.org, most recently by Thorstein Siglarsson, is comparing states. So we have the benefit in the United States of America of having been individual states that amalgamated or federated, but still retain certain rights to manage themselves. So, even the stark one of North Dakota versus South Dakota, there were big differences. I mean, and not amongst the population, but the way the experiment happened. And we were able to see, state by state, New York State versus Florida, California, versus Texas, and so forth. These responses, and a lot of places, though, followed kind of the marching orders, in a sense from above, somewhat. And I don't want to be conspiratorial, but they kind of followed the WHO kind of and whatever fill in the blank global organization handbook about how to handle this. Oh, you have to lock down, you have to do this, and so forth. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
It's unclear the ultimate source of the problem, which is why I sometimes just say it's due to an intellectual failing. But there's no question that the CCP exercised an outsized influence over lockdown policy the world over, and over the World Health Organization in particular. So there is this very strange moment in the middle of February where there was a junket put together by the World Health Organization and the National Institutes of Health.
And it's 2020.
Yeah, sorry. That's the only year I ever think about. And the Wellcome Trust in Great Britain, and they took a trip. Even though travel was banned to and from China, they took a private chartered airplane to Wuhan and went on a kind of a Potemkin village tour to discover all the beautiful ways in which the CCP managed the virus and crushed it. And so Fauci sent his team there, and the World Health Organization was there, and so on. And they hopped around to 5 different cities, and the CCP said, "See, look, no virus. It was tough. It was hard. We had to lock people in their homes, and it was pretty brutal. But on the other hand, it's gone now, and now life is back to normal." So they got back on the plane, and on February 24th, by the 26th of February, the World Health Organization had come out with a big report that was distributed all over the world, saying that the way to handle that China was right. The way to handle the virus is by locking down. And so everybody should immediately do it. And it was that same day that Fauci, Fauci on the 27th and 28th of February seemed to flip from being skeptical about lockdowns to being all in. And of course, Deborah Birx was all in. And this was, meanwhile, things were really flaring up in northern Italy, where there were lockdowns taking place. So the U.S. was next in line. And then once the U.S. fell, then everybody else around the world fell. So I think had something to do with the perception. Of course, there are tons of fake videos that were coming out of China showing people dropping dead on the streets, and all this kind of stuff. And all later turned out to be fake.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of political theater. I mean, I think there was a certain political tension, obviously, during the Trump administration, who had, like quote unquote trade war as a lever to change China policy. Right. And I don't know that this was a direct counter
response. Yeah, I've wondered about that too. That raises really interesting questions too, because we know that a lot of people, and by the way, I disagreed with the Trump's trade policy. I always thought that trade wars are never a good idea. They lead to bad outcomes. And so I didn't like what he was doing with China. My friends and I all disagree on this point. But I've wondered if there was a certain retaliatory motivation there, because a lot of people were very upset that Trump had upended 70 years of trade policy in the U.S. In favor of his own new vision. It wasn't just China; it was all over the world. So that might have provided certain impetus on the part of.
Well, I'm gonna remain agnostic on the topic. I think that the Cold War, if we go back a generation, the Cold War, nobody liked the Cold War, but the Cold War is better than the hot war. And the way we operate these days is through these kind of I guess economic bullying. I mean, we see it with the Russia-Ukraine divide currently. So we are going to do this and that to Russia, and they are going to do this and that, and so forth. And it's better than nuclear warheads. So I'm just going to leave that aside. But I again, I don't tend to be a conspiracy guy, but I do think things happen, and then people kind of amalgamate around them, or there's a term of art called the conspiracy of interests, and something happens, and then people whose interests align with it. So I don't think necessarily, it doesn't seem to me that it was a deliberate leak from China, but once it's there, people can act and do things in a certain way, and then conspiracies form around this, a little bit like a snowstorm. Nobody knows exactly when it's going to start and over which city, and it could just be a certain kernel of salt or whatever that crystallizes the snowstorm. Once it's there, people react, and they're either in favor or opposed to the snowstorm.
Right.
And they want, if they want to skip school, they're in favor of more snow and so forth. So in the same way, I think as this kind of occurred, people clearly used it as a cudgel to get certain things to occur. And I think it became a device for the unelection of President Trump. I think that it played out. I don't think it was a pre-conspiracy. I don't think it was a pre-conspiracy. I don't think there are many pre-conspiracies, but I do think that people rally around one thing or another.
Yeah, once the lockdown started happening and the stock market collapsed, and unemployment went through the roof, and we entered into an immediate Great Depression, and Congress started spending trillions of dollars. Well, Trump's enemies said, "Well, this is great. I bet let's keep this up between now and November," which sounds, in a sense, sadistic.
Yeah, it is.
But also, I think what many people have underestimated is just how intensely Trump deranged syndrome affected a certain class.
Well, I think it's partially that, and I think it's actually power love syndrome. That people love power, and power brings money brings power, and so forth. I think they want to be at the spigot. They want to be regulating the flow. It goes to their friends, not your friends, and I think this almost anything goes, to quote Cole Porter, and so I think there's really what is it P.T. Barnum said, nobody went broke underestimating the gullibility of the American public. I forget, but I think you would be cautious to underestimate the need for power, and not you, but one should be, and we've seen that.
I mean, Deborah Birx in her book really lays it out. I mean, she imagined herself suddenly to be the dictatress of the country, and imagined herself battling this beast called COVID, and the way she was going to battle it was the way she believed she should have battled AIDS, which was through extreme behavioral controls, universal condoms, and
I was thinking of getting a total body.
Yeah, well, that's essentially for her what the masks were, right? It was just a sort of a face condom, and that's the way she looked at it. And so she was a big champion of masks, and the evidence just doesn't matter. In her book, it's pretty interesting. She says in July 1st or something like that, she traveled to Arizona to try to convince the governor of the importance of mask mandates. And she succeeded, and so Arizona masked up. And then she says in her book, by July 15th, the cases were going down dramatically. So proof that masks work. Well, just before I got on this interview with you, I looked up cases in Arizona. I mean, they're like this many, and it just went up a little bit, went down a little bit. Meanwhile, we had two gigantic successive waves later. This one, this big, and then another one this big. Long after the mask mandates were universal. So, I mean, these are preposterous claims. But it's incredible. What do they call it? Confirmation bias. I mean, throughout the whole book, whatever she did, ended up achieving great results, and wherever she did.
She's a great person. I called her based on her scarf, and that she saw her kind of self as an ace pilot. I called her Scarf Ace.
Yeah. It's a remarkable book, but just the level of arrogance and the belief that she and she alone was going to battle a respiratory virus that had to become endemic, that 90% of the population was going to get at least, and probably get 2-3 times, but across the entire planet Earth because of its prevalence, and that she and she alone was going to contain it. Because
no, they're huge kind of ego fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
I had this. I'm kind of bringing a total non sequitur, but I was thinking of it earlier from something you said. When I was a kid, I had this dream. There's a huge block of ice. It was a sweltering day. Right now it's 90 degrees, and I had kind of one of those lion tamer whips, and my job was to have the ice not melt. And so I was circling this cube of ice on a table, and kind of in a cage, and I kept whipping the ice. Every time I saw a little bit of ice melt, I'd go around the other side, and I was convincing the ice not to melt, and it was exhausting. I remember just like, I can't keep up with this. It's so hot, and I'm getting hot, and so forth. It was just the dream has stayed with me a zillion years.
That's so interesting. That's a great metaphor for what she was attempting to do. And of course, in service of this goal, she was willing to lie, cheat, and steal. I mean, she tricked Trump into the first 2-week lockdown, and she said that she knew. She says this in her book. She knew that it was going to have to be extended because 2 weeks was nothing. So it's
a foot in the door.
Yeah, it's just a foot in the door. So it was never going to be 2 weeks, and she knew that from the outset. And then she went in, asked for another 30 days, which Trump gave her. But I'm trying to think now, what was the exact date? At some point, he began to get suspicious of her. I'm going to say it was middle of April. Mm-hmm. And stopped talking to her and stopped inviting her to meetings and that sort of thing. So he was already kind of on to her. But Trump's great mistake was not disabling their power.
Yeah.
So what ended up, in effect, happening was we had this unified front from middle of March that led to these terrible, egregious lockdowns. But by a month later, and certainly by 6 weeks later, you really had two separate executive governments. I mean, one that was elected by the people, Trump and the White House, and more and more rationality was starting to dominate that place, and they were regretting all the lockdowns and that sort of thing. And then you had the deep state executive agencies controlled by Fauci and Farrar and Redfield were running their own little lockdown programs, and that situation persisted between April and November, where they were going on, local media and doing all this stuff, and they were, pursuing one policy. Meanwhile, the Trump administration itself was pursuing a different policy. So how did they get away with that? And as best I can tell, the guy on the inside of the Trump administration that was most friendly to Birx and Fauci and that gang was, of course, of all people, Mike Pence. He was the guy.
That's kind of sad. I was unaware of that.
Yeah, it was Mike Pence and a few others within the Trump administration that I would say just basically betrayed Trump. Now, I'm not a Trump apologist because he never should have gone along with this. And you have to wonder what's wrong with the person's ego. They can imagine that they could just greenlight a shutdown of the whole U.S. economy.
Yeah, no, I think they scared him. I mean, yeah. I get it. He's on the other side of 70, I think, at the time. And, I think that maybe there's a little personal thing. And I think he suffered when he got COVID-19. Just as a footnote, to my listeners, I have my little repetitive trope, which is that COVID-19 doesn't exist anymore. It's not around. People keep talking about it, getting COVID-19 booster. And I would like to make a framework, and maybe this is an article proposal for you, but I'd like to make a framework to get this new terminology, COVID-20, COVID-21, and COVID-22 to be talked about. And
that's a really interesting point. That's I'd never really thought of that before, which explains why the immunity is of not perfect
Right.
once it's acquired from recovery.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of I would, as a physician, I've given out, I don't know, some tens of thousands of vaccines over the years. And I can't give you a number. And I've taken dozens. Every year I got the flu shot and so forth because I saw it as a very reasonable precaution because I was going to be seeing lots of people with influenza.
Uh-huh.
And that was when I was young too. I mean, it's just right along the way. So I'm very pro-vaccine, but prior, before an infection, not after. A and B. Had I trotted out, if I had gone, there were a couple of years here and there where there were shortages of vaccines. That's a whole separate topic of why there are shortages. Governmental interactions, whatever. But there were times there were shortages. But if I had gone in and trotted out a 3-year-old vaccine and say, look, we ran out of, influenza 2011, but I've got some 2008 stuff in the closet over there, and I'm going to give that to you instead. I mean, I would be, whatever the verb for I would be malpracticed upon. I'd be sued, and probably carted away and so forth for a danger to the person, especially if they had any side effects from it, because they say, well, that influenza is long gone. I say, well, they're all influenzas. I mean, anyway, it would be a very feeble defense on my part, and I'd soon suffer for making a mistake. But yet, we're calling these things boosters when far from it. I mean, they're not boosters for anything ever anymore. And vaccines work prior. They don't really work that well after the fact. When we give a tetanus booster, this is in the situation where people have continued not to have tetanus. We would never give a tetanus booster after the person's had tetanus, and so forth. It's just kind of, everything's kind of been, terminologically turned on its head, including, the Wikipedia pages for the definitions of herd immunity, which have become, vaccine based rather than actual, native, kind of, I guess, outdoor general exposure.
Oh, which reminds me, I've got this book is so bad. This Deborah Burke's book, but she, in her section on herd immunity, she said it only pertains to livestock. I mean, we.
Well, I think that's kind of how she views a fair amount of the population.
Yeah, it's very strange though, because we use the term herd immunity because on one hand, yes, it does apply to livestock, but it applies to I guess all living mammals in a way. I mean, and the idea is it's a mathematical idea that within a certain variant, a certain strain of a certain whatever it happens to be, especially with respiratory viruses, that a certain number of people get it, and therefore, the virus can't find a new host and leaves whatever it is, 10% up to 30% or 40% of the population alone. But it's just pure. It has to do with the mathematics of viral spread, and to deny it is tantamount to denying gravity. This is not.
Yeah, no, it's craziness.
It's
not. They've made a lot of these kind of political judgments, which politics has clearly suffused and infused itself within medicine as we see now. Like certain ethnic groups are supposed to get the vaccine before other or color, race groups, whatever. New York City, but they had kind of poor grounding. I think it was in Indonesia. They went ahead and decided that I think they did a reasonable game theory approach. They decided that the more mobile fraction of the population, say kind of your FedEx delivery coterie, postal service, the people who are kind of in communication with other people on a higher rate, they were going to get the vaccine first. Most places decided the elderly are going to get the vaccine first, which is fine. But if you play kind of a game theory approach, so they're at the distant nodes. And the center of, if you're playing, I don't know, that kind of Chinese checkers, it's the center of the board where the action happens. And if you can, have that bunch that are in conduit and communication with people, vaccinated first, presumably you'd build up your buffer as a preventive. I know Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya are on part of, written for Brownstone, and they have this concept of focus protection, which I think deals with this in part. Of protecting and kind of siloing or isolating the elderly. But there was always this mistake as if everybody was the same. That the kind of the case fatality rates differ from orders of magnitude. I think it's probably 10 or 100,000 times, lower fatality rate if you're a 10-year-old, healthy 10-year-old versus a nursing home 84-year-old. And people are just treated as kind of this, I call it a Soviet kind of way, kind of a block binary way.
Yeah.
It was outrageous right from the get-go.
Yeah, that's right. And still to this day, people are not aware of the huge disparity of risk based on age demographics. Just completely confused about it. And every day, Fauci's out there sowing more confusion. But that was a very important and even deliberate confusion, because if we're going to lock down a whole population, then and actually Birx talks about this, that she didn't believe focused protection was possible. So therefore, you have to lock down 100% of everybody, even though the highest risk groups are those people who are 80 and above with comorbidities. And she knew this. Well, there's another interesting moment in the book. She says, we could never have done what Sweden did. I think Fauci has said the same thing. We'd never have done what Sweden did and just used, sort of traditional public health methods for controlling, for managing a pathogen, because that's a much healthier population. Okay, that's a very strange thing to say, because what you're saying is, because we're all fat and unhealthy, we have to be locked down. We have to be
present company excluded.
Yeah, that's right. But we have to be, in general, the whole population has to be locked down because we're not healthy enough to deserve freedom. I mean, it's a very strange decision.
No, it's amazing. I think she would have found common cause in Australia, which I guess began as a penal colony, and nobody knew it was going to wind up as one.
Yeah.
No, it's easy to laugh. I mean, I don't know where they are now. I was reading, I haven't read in depth, but I was reading that New Zealand wants to kind of jump back in that game to follow the beacon of Shanghai, China, and lock everybody down, because Omicron, vicious, horrible Omicron is around.
Well, what's funny about that is the zero COVID people, you don't hear much from them anymore, but all the policies in a lot of these countries, including to some extent of the US and Britain, but certainly in Australia and New Zealand, were aspiring to destroy COVID through lockdowns. And they figured that once they did that the virus would be gone forever. I don't know where the virus goes. They never explained that.
Well, this is another one of my familiar tropes for people who watch this regularly, but it's new to you. So, what I compare it to is a wolf versus I don't know what kind of dog you may not have. I have a Chihuahua pug. So a wolf has an animal reservoir. That is to say, he has a place he can go off on his own. He's not reliant on humans for his meals on a regular basis. Coyotes, foxes, etc. They're eating whatever, the squirrels and raccoons and whatever, small birds, whatever they can get their hands on. They don't need humans. They don't have to be nice to us. So when we intersect, and this is for any kind of jungle, forest animal who could be vicious, when we intersect with one, but I like wolves because we have dogs. So when we intersect with them originally, we are at risk for them because they have no investment in our health, and we have no investment in theirs. So they bite us, eat us, and run away, and they can run back into the woods. So they have their zoonotic host area, their refuge. Over time, the wolves and us, let's say we reach some kind of concord, and the wolves gradually kind of are bred into, I guess, our schnauzers and whatnot, our Pomeranians and Bichon Frise and so forth. And so at this point, they can still bite you. A pit bull might be dangerous, and you can get diseases, and every now and then, somebody gets a hand ripped off by looking at a dog the wrong way. But for the most part, the dogs don't kill us, and we don't kill the dogs because we've reached an accord. They don't have an animal refuge anymore, or forest refuge anymore. And so they're amongst and with us. So 1 out of 5 coronaviruses before our famous, either SARS 2003 or COVID-19, where did they come from? They probably came from the same place, from some animal place, but over time they self-attenuated and acclimated to us and vice versa. And it's not in they don't have brains, but it's not in their interest to kill us because they can't spread as fast. Not like they have brains, but on a mathematical game theory basis, if they knock people down immediately, they're not unable to spread. And the other example I've used before is crowd surfing. That's when the singer like Ariana Grande, she might weigh 90 pounds, 80 pounds. She's up there and she jumps into the crowd. She's very light and she can be kind of crowd surfed all around and back onto the stage and keep singing. Meatloaf, God rest his soul, has a different effect. He jumps into the crowd, he creates a crater, and the crowd reacts to Meatloaf jumping into the crowd by stepping away and making boundaries. So it's a different reaction, and that can be like the Ebola effect. That can be very much like a bomb and very dangerous and lethal for that general area. But Ebola doesn't take over the world because we react to Ebola, and Ebola doesn't spread kind of innocuously through enough people to get enough reach. So if something wants to not have, and again, I'm imparting agency, but if somebody wants not to have a zoonotic refuge. So influenza comes in like a storm every year because they are in domestic pigs in China, and every year there's an incubation of a new strain. But if you don't have that refuge, and you're just going to be with us, like the common cold, adenovirus, RSV, rhinovirus, et cetera, then you can only go from person to person. But you have to be crowd surfing, and you can't kill the crowd.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry for that divergence, but the thing is that everyone assumes still that it's a wolf. It is not a wolf anymore. We have a vaccine against that wolf, but that's COVID-19. You can call the ancestral version, which sounds old in and of itself. Before the Greek letters versions, and for people to be kind of imputing or assuming that that's what's going on now in terms of zero COVID is idiotic, because there will never be a world with zero COVID. There wasn't a world of zero COVID before 2003 SARS, because again, like 15 to 20% of every common cold is a coronavirus, and this one will turn into something like that. It already has in a sense. And people have to, basically chill. That's my medical advice.
My read on the situation from the very beginning. And if I could, as an economist, I looked it up. What is a coronavirus? How do you control it? And I saw that you can't ultimately wipe it out with vaccines. That it just has to become endemic. If I knew that from January of 2020. There's no way that people like Fauci and Birx and Redfield could not have discovered that.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to say the right answer. My speciality, as they say in England, has been Zika, kind of a total out of the blue. I'm not a Zika expert. I'm not a tropical disease. I've never been to Brazil, et cetera. But I became interested in Zika as a puzzle a few years ago. When it first came out, I thought it was really weird that dengue, which is essentially a twin, dengue is the human version of Zika, which is the primate version of the same virus. That dengue had been endemic, millions of cases forever, and never caused any microcephaly, and supposedly Zika did. Anyway, fast forward, I had other things to do, and a few years later, I kind of revisited it. I thought, well, now was enough time to see, and Zika kind of had disappeared, but Fauci is in the middle of all that story, and there's kind of like the evidence is clear that it disappeared, and maybe somebody could at least question the original theory, which is my basic premise, and they don't. I think there's kind of an industry that people neglect. That people have financial, getting back to economics, they have financial motivations, they have personal motivations. They're also part of kind of a tribe, a group of ideas, and throughout the Zika thing, it's been push. Even today, they are literally infecting American citizens with Zika in Baltimore. To get a Zika, the imaginary or elusive Zika vaccine, when there's really no need for it here, obviously, and there's no need worldwide. But there's money to be spent, and there's an industry to be had, there's research and so forth. And in this case, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but there are patents, there is industry, and there's a huge pharma kind of sinecure we've made that creates a lot of excess income, and that some of that kind of gets filtered around to the people who help make the decisions.
It has become an industry. The pandemic preparedness industry is actually very dangerous because once you've got billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars at stake, you have the incentive to turn every new pathogen out there into a global crisis. The monkeypox hysteria of last month is a good example. Yeah. And the fact that and the language gets very loose. I mean, the media wants to do this too, because the media needs clicks and views. and they never prospered as much as they did during COVID. So,
Yeah.
so
I'm,
when
I'm just hoping the monkeys out there don't read this stuff.
yeah, right. But when this new strain came along, CNN blew up and said this is the most virulent strain yet. Well, okay, so the word virulent is
Exactly right.
I mean, it's like, wait, where did this word come from? So we're talking about virulence, okay? But there's two forms of virulence.
Right.
There's severity and prevalence. Those are really different. In fact, there's a trade-off between the two. So virulence, what they mean by virulence is transmissibility
Right.
or prevalence.
I know it's funny because in the common parlance we say, "Oh, this video that could be Cardi B or whatever, it went viral. Everybody's watching this." Or some kid who, Linda, the little kid, like everybody saw that. That went viral. But as far as I know, it didn't kill anybody.
Right.
And so this, the mere aspect of virulence, and I hope this video goes viral. But I'm assuming it's not going to kill anybody. But it's going to get back to Monty Python. At one point, they had the greatest weapon, and this is the Great War. The funniest joke ever told. I don't know if you ever saw that one.
Oh yeah.
And so he's got the funniest joke, and people can't read it because if they read it, they die laughing.
Right.
And so they keep the funniest joke under lock and key and so forth. And somebody, I guess, opens it by mistake. Anyway, hilarity ensues, but to a bad purpose. But at any rate, so for the funny thing is that we've kept, or they have kept, a lot of information under lock and key. I interviewed Jay Bhattacharya, doctor, back in January, and I guess reasonably prior, the FOIA had come out showing that doctors, and I use the word loosely, doctors Collins and Fauci had conspired against the clearance of the Great Barrington proposition of focused protection. Doctors, I see PhD, Dr. Koldorf, Sunitra Gupta, and Jay Bhattacharya, and it's weird. I mean, they're assuming that knowledge outside of what they're putting out is it shouldn't be seen.
Yeah, they said let's have a hard takedown of this as soon as possible. But by that time, that was October. I mean, by that time, 6 months of lockdowns had gone by. The lockdowns were not working; they were destroying life on Earth, but they were destroying also Trump's prospects for re-election. So they wanted to keep it up to November. So it's very important to them to suppress.
The ends justify the means.
Yeah, at that point, it became very important to suppress alternative ways of thinking. I had been writing against lockdown since January of 2020, and in April, I got a call from Rajiv. God, I can't remember his last name, but he was a former Gates virus guy. He headed up viruses for the Gates Foundation, and now ran his own. Rajiv Venkala, I guess his name was, and he was around in the Bush administration in 2005. So he believes that he's the originator of these kind of violent pandemic responses. It was originally his idea. And he was very upset at me. This is in April, I guess, of 2020. Called me up, just wanted me to stop writing about it. Just like stop opposing these lockdowns. It's really dangerous. And I was just a guy writing stuff on the internet, And he spent a better part of 30 minutes or a little bit more trying to talk me out of my views. And
out of the blue?
Yeah. Because they really wanted a united front. They didn't want anybody out there. So I was personally targeted pretty early on as a guy that they had to get rid of. And of course, they talked all the social media companies into becoming their propaganda organs. So Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and everybody else just went right in line, started echoing CDC, WHO propaganda, and crushing all dissonant thought. And they kept it up. And then even after the election, right? It got even worse.
Absolutely. Well, the election, there's a meme that says they're only after me to get to you. Do you remember that? There's a picture of Donald Trump, and so he took a lot of hits, and he's sort of Teflon-ish. as far as it seemed, whether they're going to bother him. But clearly, once the reins of power, came back into the right hands, I think they have a nice little shiny tool to use again and again potentially. And I don't think this would have existed. I've tried to convince people in the synagogue of this and other places, like the tennis club and whatever, and other groups and whatever. Oh, it's an investment group, and each one of them, I become the outlier by essentially, saying, giving facts and the data. I think the whole thing was an open and shut case early on. When the Diamond Princess event happened, and if you wanted to replicate that experiment at any point during the difficult times of 2020, it would have cost you tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to get enough people on the boat to volunteer. But there was this boat, and it was January of 2020, and 3,700 people on board. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. But the case fatality rate was basically what ultimately was there. The incidence rate of even kids even knowing they had it was low. I mean, the thing circulated. The air circulates in the boat. You have this perfect experiment. He wanted to see what a virus would do, and the young people didn't even know they had it. None of them died. None of the middle-aged people really got sick at all, minimally, colds and whatnot. And at the end of the day, there were 10 fatalities out of 3,700 people, but the median age was 82. And even though that's kind of a small experiment, that replicated through every population
Right.
thereafter. But everybody knew this right to begin with. And if you had a little perspicacity or digging capability, you would have trotted that out because it was in the news. That boat was kept at sea off the coast of Japan.
Yep, the Diamond Princess told us pretty much everything we needed to know. So one wonders, really. And these days you hear all the time. You say, well, it's the fog of war. We didn't know. March, April, we didn't know. We knew.
Yeah.
We knew.
Yeah.
And Eden Eades wrote his article in Stat News, I guess probably 5 days into the lockdowns. Maybe it was March 20th, maybe 23rd, something like that. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, this is a wild overreaction. And he gave all the data from the Diamond Princess in there. So it was well known. There's no excuse for what they did. None whatsoever.
No. So I'd like to segue a little bit into you, because I'm very impressed. You get this call and whatnot. I assume I'd like to kind of hear and follow the story of where you get your vision and how you manifest and keep your strength.
Concerning infectious diseases, or just in generally speaking?
Well, let's just kind of follow up on this. Did you stop doing what you were doing when asked, for instance?
Oh, of course not. I mean, no, it's unthinkable, right? I mean, all I've really ever cared about was examining and thinking about and writing about the nobility of human freedom and the threats to it. I mean, that's all.
Therefore, you must be crushed.
Right. I mean, I fell in love with the idea of human liberty as an sort of an animating force in the world when I was about 20 years old. I was in college, and it was from my own reading. And, that's what caused me to give up my music career, which I was very good and, that sort of thing. But pursue economics full time. Because I just fell in love with an idea. So, and I try to pursue it honestly, right? I mean, I'm not some sort of dogmatist. I became convinced of the practical utility and moral imperatives of the idea of human freedom and human rights pretty early on, and I've been willing to subject that to every test ever. And I've spent a whole career, just looking for a good case against those ideals, and I've never been able to find them. And that's one of the things that drew me to infectious diseases, is that as early as 2005 and 2006, with the avian bird flu under the George W. Bush administration, the existence of infectious disease was being cited as a reason to violate people's liberties and to grow government power immensely. So I knew this threat was out there. I was writing about the topic back then. And actually, my 2005 article on this topic actually holds up pretty well.
I'll have to check it
So,
out.
and over the subsequent 15 years, I'd written 2 or 3 articles against the quarantine power. So I was just very interested. I'm also fascinated. For years, I've been fascinated by the reasons that people give for why we can't have freedom. And if you talk to people long enough, they'll mention, oh, because of roads, oh, because of healthcare, or whatever. But inevitably, at some point, somebody's going to bring up pandemics. You can't have freedom in a pandemic. So I've always been curious about that. Is that true? Is that really true?
Well, I can't answer that. I'm not a historian, but I'm not a biologist. But the thing is, it's for me, it's a matter of degree. Should people have knives in their kitchens, and nobody's really talking about knife control, and people are able to, kind of manage knives. And in the United States, the NRA, I don't think there's ever, within recent memory, been a murder by an NRA member. So people are able to deal with responsibility and risk and so forth. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can have a knife-free house should you care to. It makes it probably, your dining choices somewhat limited, but you could just call in Chipotle as you will. But the freedom part, I think it threatens people who have less imagination. The Postal Service, in my view, is vestigial and probably has been for a good length of time. I think the fire departments are not completely vestigial, but they don't need to be around to the same extent they have. But they get a what's the word I'm looking for? Not a momentum, but a kind of a critical, a certain mass, and they are unavoidable. They create their own gravity in a sense. They become large enough. I think that's a tiny sideline, but in terms of fires, I think if you go from 1970 to the present, so 50 years, there are, I think, twice as many people, just roughly say, in the United States. And despite twice as many people in denser circumstances, there are, I think, again, I can't come up with a number, but say there are like three or four times fewer fires. And firemen per se make more, even in real dollars, now than they did then. So there are more firemen per person, making more per fireman in normalized dollars, with fewer fires. And what happened to the fires? I mean, basically we have sensors, we got smoke detection, we have all the code, better application of whatever. So we have all these fire prevention needs, but nobody's talking about getting rid of firemen. We could easily get rid of mailmen, so forth, but they create their own guild, basically their own kind of political power and nexus. And in a sense, what will probably be one of the outcroppings of this adventure or misadventure is that pharmaceuticals got very, very wealthy, and they have a nifty way of, fear is a one of the natural aspects of every animal, and fear of the unknown is probably the essence of it. And people who have nifty little tools and toys like to use them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and so it becomes very dangerous, especially in the case of infectious disease, because fires are localized, and contained within by geography. That's not true with viruses; they affect the whole society, and so the World Health Organization likes to say this. For infectious disease, we need an all of society, all of government response.
Right.
That's what they always say.
Yeah.
So it becomes potentially totalitarian.
Absolutely.
And we saw how this is true over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah. And the tendency is to exaggerate. I guess the point I started to think of making, but I didn't, was the example of George Washington and smallpox. I guess he forced the vaccination, such as it was back then, of taking somebody's pox and sticking it in somebody else, and it was a very rudimentary vaccination. But smallpox is a very, very, very deadly virus. So it comes down to a matter of degree. If it becomes a zombie apocalypse, sure, we can think about this, and
right.
there are gradations. But if it's a zombie, whatever, and what is it, 99.7 something percent survival. And again, the ones who are dying are in a nursing home with a life expectancy of about 11 months anyway. Sure, that's sad, but it's not something for which you should ruin the lives of 8-year-olds.
Well, and the other case of the George Washington example is fascinating. He just didn't want his troops suddenly to come, for there to be a smallpox outbreak and for them to lose the war as a result.
Mm-hmm.
But he himself had smallpox when he was young and knew for sure that he had lifetime immunities. All right. So they were sophisticated. It's the 18th century. They knew this. So his inoculation mandate did not pertain to himself.
Yeah. Well, this is a funny thing.
Or anybody else who had already had smallpox.
Yeah. So going from George Washington to Washington Irving to Kyrie Irving, which is the segue I wanted to make, one of our great founding fathers, Kyrie Irving, people kind of, he's a polarizing figure, a basketball player, but I actually agree with him on this one point, which is, he didn't want to get vaccinated. He says, look, I mean, he's got, I think, religious ideas about it and for some personal, oddities and whatnot. But he says, I've had coronavirus. He had the ancestral version originally, and he's fine. And so there's no reason to take an extra thing. So he's with, so to make that string, George Washington, Irving, Kyrie, he's actually along the lines of George Washington, understanding that he's going to have immunity to the severe version of COVID. And there is no point to it except dogma, doctrinaire, kind of dictates.
That's right. And it's not perfect immunity, but it's much stronger and broader than any vaccine ever could be for this kind of virus. You have cross immunities. And Sinatra knew this very early on. I mean, she told me this in October of 2020. She said, there's no way a vaccine can replicate the effectiveness of natural immunity. And that's just a known fact.
There's no way. Again, one of my silly examples or analogies is like your dog or my dog could pick me if you dropped him into a football stadium and there's thousands of people. He would, presuming he had enough time, he'd find me. Okay, he has complete identification of who I am based on my movements, my voice. I could probably snap my fingers a certain way, and he would sift his way to find me. He has complete Randy Bach immunity. Versus, the dog in the movies, whatever they, sniffs my undershirt or whatever, and then he tries to find me. There's going to be a lot more kind of hedging and false positives based on a scent. When we do the vaccines with this, A spike protein, we're just maybe taking, the virus's nose or what his eyes look like, and then trying to apply that, and you're going to be able to be on the lookout. Having had the illness, you've had the totality, just like my dog has lived with me. You've lived with the virus when you have the actual virus. And you're going to have a fuller, better, more complete immunity. And, essentially the true definition of herd immunity is when you have enough people with that. And that was never supposed to be vaccine immunity. It's one of the great kind of subtle crimes that the definitions were kind of percolated out from the CDC and whatnot to change the definitional term of herd immunity to be natural infection to vaccine application.
Yep. Yeah. And actually, I mean, there's a lot of terrible things that Fauci and Birx did over the course of the last 2 years, but the most outrageous was just this repeated denial that they knew anything about natural immunity, that we couldn't trust it, and Fauci was asked again and again about this. He said, I don't know, we're still looking into that. We just don't know anything.
He has a variable memory when it's kind of. I think he's got certain kind of an onion layer. And certain things that are centrally, he's not going to let you.
Well, it all makes me very sad, Randall, because the public has been so profoundly misled. And I'm reading a lot. I'm writing a lot. You are too, and we talk, and we put out this podcast. And Brownstone has a very high readership. But I spent the last several days, not entirely of my own intention, but hopping around from airport to airport, and I would say there's at least 25% of the public is profoundly confused. I mean, the masks that people are wearing now are not, the little surgical masks, just keep you from spitting into somebody's organs. They're the N95 stuff
Yeah.
and extreme stuff, and people wearing these gigantic dog beaks or duck
Yeah,
bills.
that's great. I mean, I theoretically would wear them if you put Skittles and M&Ms inside, and I could.
Yeah, right. But it's so interesting because I was sitting, I'm just puzzled. And if I were a blunter person, I would just go up, tap these people on the shoulder and say,
No,
what?
it's. Yeah, well, I'm sort of on that verge of that. I mean, I don't go up to people randomly, but if I'm at the supermarket or whatever, I was at Staples not that long ago, and a young kid, judging from what I could see of his face, is about 23, 24 years old.
Yeah.
And if he's clerking me, I'll say, hey, so do they make you wear that here? I kind of have a little stock question to get people to talk about it. And same thing with the poster. So I open these conversations when I'm encountering somebody, vice versa. So I don't go up to people randomly, but I ask the Socratic question. I mean, so if it's their own choice, I'm like, are you planning on wearing one in like 10 years from now? Oh no, absolutely not. Oh, 5 years from now? No. How about a year? So like, well, what's going to be the decision point that's going to make you come to the realization you can come out now? I mean, the Japanese soldier in the Philippines, he continued the war until 1963 or something like that. I don't know if you know that story.
There was a lady walking by wearing this huge duck bill on her face, and I was kind of laughing at her. Well, to my surprise, she turned and looked at the little bar where I was sitting, and then sat down in the chair right next to me. And I thought, well, now I kind of felt bad because I was staring at her with a look of disapproval in a way. I think she didn't notice. So she sits down right next to me, pulls the thing off her head, sets it down, and turns to me very closely and says, "Hi, how are you today?"
Well.
And I said, "Well, I'm fine." And she just went about her business. So she's walking in the airport, no closer than 3 to 5 feet from anybody, and she's all masked up. Then she sits down, and do people actually believe this? That they sit down at a bar, and that the sheer act of sitting and resting,
No, it's craziness.
makes you protection for the virus. So I don't understand it. I don't know if people have just decided to not think clearly, or what's going on here.
Well, I think most everything comes down to group dynamics. I mean, they're baseball fans, but they wouldn't consider themselves baseball fans. They're Red Sox fans, they're Yankee fans, they're Mets fans, and the Yankee fans don't like the Mets fans, vice versa. Red Sox, and they disdain each other, even though they all are practicing the same thing. They eat the same way. There's a lot of team tribal identity. I think that's very deeply rooted within us. We need some banner. But I'm going to, before I finish my sentence, I want to just give a 2-minute warning, get back to sports. We're going to have to stop to stay under an hour.
Okay.
And so I'd like maybe, if you have a finishing statement I want to leave people with.
Yeah, sure. But I'm not sure what it would be, except that I would say that we still have a lot of research and to look into, what exactly happened here. I'm personally obsessed with the topic. I read every book that comes out on this and trying to piece together the story. I think we're eventually going to get it, but we're only 20-30% the way there. It's not. There's a lot of moving parts here, and I do think we need to devote some effort and time into figuring it out, figure out what happened, but then also rethinking what it is that went wrong with our social order and with individuals that allowed us to permit this to happen, and think through what are the conditions under which we can prevent this from ever happening again. I think this is an extremely urgent thing we have to do in our times, as in right now, and it's going to, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to probably consume the rest of my life on Earth.
Well, fair enough. I am very much appreciative of your life on Earth, and I wish you continued good health and blessings and strength and power in what you're doing, because I think it's very important. So I'm going to commend everybody to go look at brownstone.org, and I'll put up some links. And I'm in your debt. Please let me know how I can return the favor someday. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for spending the time with me. All the best.
Have a good one.